Welcome to this week's edition of Chatting the Pictures. I'm Kara Finnegan, and I'm a writer, teacher, and historian of photography.
And I'm Michael Shaw. I'm a writer, a psychologist, and also the publisher of Reading the Pictures.
Michael, we're really excited to have a special guest with us today.
Hey, I'm John Mason, and I teach African history and the history of photography at the University of Virginia. I'm writing a book about the great American writer, photographer, filmmaker Gordon Parks, and I'm a photographer myself.
Our discussion this week deals with race and the mass protests that followed the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis at the hands of a white police officer. For 2 weeks, the media and social media has been saturated with powerful and disturbing protest photos. Our intention is to discuss some different kinds of images from this historic moment. John, this week, authored an excellent essay for National Geographic titled, "Photos Can Show Protests' Complexity, or They Can Perpetuate Old Lies." Our discussion addresses two of the portraits John wrote about in his article.
Here is our first image.
This photograph was taken by Ruddy Roye for National Geographic. The caption reads, "Kyle Errison raises a fist in solidarity with marchers who chanted justice for George Floyd." Errison says, "I have been harassed by NYPD, and in a way, I understand this struggle personally."
So, John, I noticed that this photo leads your essay, and I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that.
I like this one for all sorts of reasons. It's a really great picture. It captures a moment of defiance, and I wanted that. I did not want a picture of an African American as a victim. It is funny in a way because you have a young man wearing a go ahead and call the cops t-shirt with an NYPD, New York Police Department van in the background. And he's wearing a mask, which puts us in the moment of the COVID pandemic. So it's doing a lot of different things. But I think most importantly, I wanted an image that was defiant on the one hand, but also not overtly angry, and one that has no hint of violence in it.
I think that's really interesting, especially in light of the kind of double gesture of the fist raised and then the tattoo of the fist raised that he has on his arm, which emphasizes your point about defiance. But I think it also really hits your point about history. There is a reason this man has that tattoo. And I'm sure that for him, it connects to a long history of protest and struggle and a desire to define a space for himself and members of his community.
I'll be honest, and I was not focused on his tattoo. And so that raised fist, we associate that so strongly with the 1960s and with a particular moment in 1968 at the Olympics when two American sprinters raised their fist. So I like the fact that there is a deep resonance with that tattoo, and I wish I'd noticed it and written about it. So thank you.
Certainly with the fist that's always up, even if the arm is down. It does reference Mexico 68 more than, say, Ferguson 14, where the characteristic gesture was something perhaps less forceful, the hands up, don't shoot. There's also taking a knee because of the way that George Floyd was killed based on a particular police suppression technique. So there's a multiplicity of gestures there.
You're talking about gestures at this time of protest and the taking the knee, which was certainly popularized by Colin Kaepernick, which of course got him whiteballed by the NFL. I was writing about taking a knee as a gesture that has become the opposite of what it usually means, right? To take a knee, to kneel before someone has always been a sign of submission, but it's an act of fealty. And the taking the knee now, there's a striking photograph of a young African-American woman kneeling in front of a line of heavily armed police officers in riot gear. And that kneeling is anything but an act of submission. It is an act of defiance. It's almost a taunt, an incredible moment of courage.
I think that's really important. And that idea of vulnerability, even though this image is so strong, we haven't yet talked much about his face or his gaze, right? But the combination of that t-shirt, right, which is funny and also prompts the viewer to, say, whoa, what is it that I'm being invited to consider here? And then the mask. And then I noticed the Band-Aid on his forehead, which is it just a random thing that sometimes you hurt yourself and have a Band-Aid on your forehead? Is it an indication of past conflict? It's a mark of care and vulnerability.
The Band-Aid is also interesting in connection with the T-shirt or the slogan, because it really is sort of the net effect of, okay, bring it on. You know, what's the worst that can happen to us after everything that's been done? And then I think it also brings up the whole scenario, sad scenario of Christian Cooper, the bird watcher in Central Park a couple weeks ago, where he challenged a woman who was walking her dog off leash, and she started calling the police.
I wonder if he would have worn that T-shirt without the incident in Central Park. I mean, I think you might be right. It's a direct reference to that. It looks like a fairly new T-shirt, so it might be a response to that. Kara, I'm really glad you drew attention to the eyes, though. You know, he's wearing a mask, but the eyes tell us everything we need to know, don't they? Here, we can see much of his face, but we don't need to.
Here's our next image.
This photograph is by Nathan Aguirre, a street photographer in Minneapolis. It was taken on May 26th during a protest the night after George Floyd's murder. Aguirre posted it on social media, where it quickly went viral. It's a portrait of Deveonte Joseph. Deveonte has since explained that he wore the gown to speak out against police brutality and white supremacy, and to challenge racial stereotypes. The seventh of 10 siblings, Joseph is the first in his family to graduate high school with a diploma. His official graduation ceremony was canceled as a result of the coronavirus.
In American culture and American visual culture, young African American men are usually positioned as dangerous, as a threat to the viewer, as a threat to white America, as people who need to be controlled somehow, and especially by the police. Respectability politics would say that, well, he's wearing this cap and gown to say that he's not like that. He's different. He's of the better class of African American, and please don't associate him with those that are wild and untamed and need the discipline of the cops. And if somebody said that about this particular portrait, I would tell them that they're wrong, in part because of what we know about this young man, remarkable young man, to be the first high school graduate from his family. Respectability politics isn't about showing up in sneakers and jeans underneath your cap and gown. And respectability politics is not about associating yourself with those protests, but he is there associating himself. I mean, he's saying that he is part of this. I think the most important thing that this photo does is not be a stereotype, is to be a portrait of a particular young man that's caught in circumstances that invites the viewer to wonder what his story is.
When you think about the intersection of two pandemics, coronavirus and racism, and how much African Americans have been pummeled by both, made me aware of how much this moment in time was characterized by these young people losing the experience of walking in their graduation. There were many other photographs of students or graduates that were protesting in caps and gowns. There was David Gutenfelder's photo of Detel Straub and Avery Lewis and Titan Harness Reed. Sarah Beth Manny had this photo of Lewis Michael. Rochelle Olson had a photograph of Rochelle Garrison, and there are many others that we haven't seen. Kara, you also have background, a lot of familiarity with this particular locale. Is that right?
Yeah, John, I'm so glad you talked about the particularity of this photograph, the way that it invites us to really wonder about this person being photographed in this place at this moment. I grew up in St. Paul. My whole childhood took place about 2 miles from this site. Just on the edge, the left edge of the frame, across the street from the tall building behind Joseph, is a high school named after Gordon Parks. Gordon Parks High School is a relatively newly built building. It's an alternative high school, part of the St. Paul public school system. It was damaged pretty heavily on the third night of the protest, and a number of news stories from the local media talked about the complexities of that and the way that Gordon Parks himself, you know, as a figure who documented the particularity of the Black experience in precisely the way that you're talking about in this image. It just really struck me as compelling.
You know, from the time that Gordon Parks arrived in St. Paul until the time that he left, he arrived at 15, and he was about 30 years old when he left. He was always poor. He almost never had 2 nickels to rub together. I mean, he's very ambitious and very talented, and he was bound and determined to make something of himself. And when he left, he was on his way, but he was still poor. Parks never graduated from high school. You know, it's something that he always regretted. I mean, he was as remarkably self-educated as anybody who ever lived, but he was not school educated. And the last thing I want to say is that he wrestled all of his life with the question of what are Black people to do about our situation here in America. He never covered an uprising or riot as a photojournalist. He stayed away from that. But he had to talk about it in the stories that he did. He had to talk about the role of violence and protest and stories that he did on the Nation of Islam, which was then called the Black Muslims, on the Black Panthers, on a deeply impoverished family in Harlem. He had to wrestle with these questions. And he always said that he was often on the edge of violence himself. You know, he never disparaged people who picked up a rock and threw it at a cop. He understood that. Parks would understand all of this. He wouldn't be out there photographing it. He would understand it, and he would write about it. He saw his role as trying to help white Americans understand what the fuck was going on in their own country.
Here is our last image.
This photograph was taken by Krishna Sharma. It was published along with his opinion piece in the Athens Banner Herald. The caption reads, "A group of graduating seniors, notably wearing sorority letters, pose for a photo in front of the University of Georgia Arch, while a group of masked protesters demonstrate as part of a nationwide response to the death of George Floyd." And he adds in the article that peaceful protesters were tear gassed and arrested for protesting past curfew in the same spot the night before.
On the surface, it's a bunch of dumb white chicks celebrating their graduation and having a party in the midst of this nationwide act of protest and mourning over the death of George Floyd and those other people who have died in police custody. That's the surface meaning, and that could be the real meaning. We don't know what's going on in their heads. When I started teaching many, many years ago, I had a prejudice against sorority women. I thought they were a bunch of airheads and not at all serious. And my first year of teaching, I learned how wrong that is. And so I want to reject the superficial reading of it.
I really appreciate that for a number of reasons. The composition really invites and pushes that reading. I would describe the composition as clever. I mean that, I guess, both in a negative and a positive sense of that term. The photographer has very skillfully put this moment of protest within the frame of this iconic space, the Arch of the University of Georgia, which every graduate takes a picture at when they graduate. And then they've put this group of young women there too. The photograph juxtaposes all of that very nicely. But I appreciate your point that what we see may be different from that. My first thought when I saw this photograph was, oh, this is the two openings. This is a pandemic era photograph of two ways that everybody has been coming out in public, particularly in states that are more open. These two moments of when is it, quote unquote, okay to be out in public and what for, I think really play out again here. And yes, there's a racial component to that as well. And there's also a kind of question of the protesters are masked. These young women are not. So to the extent that the wearing of a mask or choosing not to wear a mask is a whole other discourse now that we're living and dealing with, that's also really animated in this photograph, I think.
This photograph bothered me so deeply, and it had to do with whose space is this? When you think about how much authority there is in the image that is invested in the university, looking at this arch and those steps and the ballards there as a racial proscenium, and just this architecturally, like in terms of the structure of this, it gives so much weighting to the university and to these kids. But these kids don't live here. The people that live here are the people that are protesting. Then if you think about how they're relegated to the street, they're on an island. I just think that the symbolism of that is just so very upsetting.
Yeah, I mean, despite what I was saying about wanting to avoid a superficial reading of this photograph, and let me say, I do not think that you are making superficial readings. You're making very sophisticated readings. But as a general statement about the state of the world, as symbolism, as metaphor, it's powerfully real. I appreciated the way Kara was talking about, the framing and the architecture of the image. We can imagine that the photographer stood there for a while trying to figure out, okay, so where do I need to be to make exactly this image with this big void right there in the middle, separating the two groups of people.
On that point, the women appear to be posing for someone else that we can't see. They're in what I think of as the undergraduate social media pose that I see my students performing often. With the exception of one of them, it's literally almost like they're two photographs. The group that are protesting are really focused, I think, on the people driving down the street that they want to influence. And they don't appear to be paying attention to those young women either. So to the extent that you're right, it does kind of create this scene of two worlds. I think the photograph is very successful. I do want to point out that the island on which the protesters are standing is in front of a relatively small obelisk that is actually a Confederate monument. It's my understanding that over the last few recent years, there have been public conversations, as there have been all over the United States, on the question of maintaining monuments, taking them down. And so to the extent that the monument itself sits in the middle of the street on this small space, and then the protesters have placed themselves there, I think it's also significant to note that, even though we can't necessarily see it in the image.
Given the events of the last 2 weeks, we're really grateful to have John Mason with us to sort out these pictures and to lend this kind of historical context to them also.
It's my pleasure. It was really great to join you guys.
We hope that you will continue to follow us at readingthepictures.org, on our Instagram feed at Reading the Pictures, and also on Twitter, where we're posting a lot of images of both pandemics at Reading the Pics. Thank you for joining us.